Hello and welcome to IR Thinker, where international affairs are discussed. I'm Martin Zubko. Today I'm curious about the concept of political myth, especially applied to Russia. I'm joined by Professor Bo Petersson. Hello.
Hello.
From Mauno University, Department of Global Political Studies, and he's also director of the Russia, Ukraine, and the CAUCASUS Regional Research Center located at the university. Professor Petersson wrote 6 books, and the latest one is The Putin Predicament: Problems of Legitimacy and Succession in Russia. Even though I'm thinking and I'm sure that he's already working on the second edition due to the ongoing events. Professor Petersson also published many peer-reviewed articles across the international high-impact journals. So I'm very delighted that he could join us today. His role today is going to be to explain to us the concept of political myth and how it can be operationalized in the analysis of the contemporary politics, especially when we speak about Russia. So we divided this talk in 6 sections, and we have 6 key questions. Let's start with the first one. How do you define the concept of political myth and how it can be applied to contemporary politics, especially when we speak about Russia? We want to have a complex view. What does it mean when we speak about the concept of political myth?
Thank you very much, Martin, and I'm delighted to be here. And so I really appreciate the invitation that you gave me. I've been working on the concept of political myth for quite some time, and there is a pretty substantive literature out there. But when going through the different definitions of political myth that are presented in the literature, I think, to my mind, the by far the best one is the one offered by the scholar of history of religions, Roland Barthes, who defined political myth as an important story, a story that makes a difference, that is important to people. I often found when giving talks outside of the academia, but also inside it, that it is a somewhat tricky concept to use, in the sense that the everyday understanding of myth is that it is something that is kind of false and deceitful, and it might very well be, but it need not. And here I rely also on the expertise of, for instance, Chiara Bottici, who argues that the inherent truth value, the philosophical truth value of the political myth is actually unimportant, because it might be wrong, it might be right, but the main thing is that it is believed in, and believed in by a substantial number of people who follow the credo of the political myth. That is, as a starter. One should also, I think, compare the concept to other related concepts that are used in the literature and are quite popular there for good reasons. I'm particularly thinking of the concept of strategic narratives. And I would say that the main difference and the reason why I have continue to cling to the concept of political myth is that I see I'm appealed by the kind of quasi-religious connotations that it has, because it is more based on emotions and emotionally laden beliefs than cognitively defined and instrumental beliefs that I think are more associated with the concept of strategic narratives. So, but again, it is a tricky concept to use in certain concepts, since try to make a point that it is a concept that can be used and should be used across many countries and contexts and cultures, not only Russia, of course. So I've also applied the concept to Sweden in my earlier writings, and then I confronted the idea of Swedish neutrality which was once upon a time with the concept of political myth, and even though I initially given a long explanation along the same lines of what I did here, that it's really doesn't matter whether it's true or false. Then there was a seasoned diplomat in the audience who raised his hand towards the end of my presentation and said that, well, he for one could not accept that I really described the notion of Swedish neutrality, for which he had labored so long during his professional career, as a myth. And then it was apparently lost that it doesn't really matter whether it was true or false. But I think its value lies in the connotations of quasi-religious appeal and mass following. That is a defining characteristic of political myth, because if unless a substantial number of people believe in it and act on it as if it was true, then it is not a political myth, and it's something else.
Right. And when you said that it's tricky to use this concept, what sort of shortcomings can you see when you read dissertations or maybe some research papers when people try to use the concept, but maybe they are not 100% accurate when using it?
Well, who am I to say who's accurate or not? Because that is a matter to be discussed in scholarly settings and in academic seminars, I think. But to my mind, the most common pitfall is to kind of use myth as synonymous to something that is deceitful and a lie, as a hoax. And so I would say that the majority of articles using the concept use it in the everyday speech manner.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of popularity, we know how, for instance, discourse is getting popular, social constructivism. What's the situation with the political myth as a concept in research at the moment?
Of course, it's a kind of it is well, part of the universe of discourse. It is you need to employ discourse analysis if you do study political myth. So it's a kind of indispensable methodological tool to get at it. But I would say that in theoretical terms, the most closely related term is the one that I mentioned on strategic narratives, and of course, again, I would say that the concept of narrative is wider than the concept of political myth.
What role do political myths play in legitimizing or delegitimizing political power and the authority in Russia? And how do Russian politicians use these myths for or to their advantages?
Yes, thank you. That is basically what I've written about in my most recent book, which, just to follow up on what you mentioned in your kind introduction there is certainly a follow-up to that book in the pipeline, but I should have advanced further than I have, but it's due to kind of be completed by the end of next year, so I hope to be able to follow that timetable.
I am sure that many interesting events will happen till that time.
I'm afraid there will be, yes. To my mind, the concept of the phenomenon of political myth has played a vast role in Putin's Russia, and Putin himself has been the master wizard here in using and wielding these political myths to his advantage. Early on, from the earliest days of his presidency, so as far back as one is able to remember, almost in the early 2000s, then he, above all, advanced two myths that were kind of mutually interdependent. The great power idea of Russia as a predetermined eternal great power, harking back to the ancestry of Peter the Great once upon a time, and the kind of God-given idea that Russia is bound to be a great power, no matter the circumstances, and so everything else was out of the question, and Putin managed to picture himself rather early on as the guarantor of the resurgence of Russian great powerhood after the unruly 1990s. Which leads me to the second myth that he managed to exploit very successfully, namely that Russia, despite this status as a great power, from time to time is subjected to periods of trouble, of smuta, as Russian term goes, of times of trouble, where the political structures are uncertain and highly challenged, when foreign intervention is afoot, and when the people need to unite behind a strong leader to throw the insurgents out. And to cut a long story short there, this is a story that, of course, then originally appeared in the early 16th century, but has then been exploited and re-exploited many times over, and presented as cyclically reappearing in Russian history. And the most recent instance of that was then, according to today's political discourse, the 1990s and the Yeltsin presidency in the wake of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And then Putin was, of course, depicted in this storytelling, in this myth, as the person who appeared in the nick of time to rescue the nation and to unite the people behind him and throw the insurgents out, to return to its kind of predetermined great powerhood. So these two political myths were connected. They depended on each other and fed off each other, so to speak. Putin and his circle of companions ruled rather solidly and securely on the basis of these two elements of political myth during the first two presidencies, thereby helped along, of course, by the very advantageous world market prices in oil and gas, which helped Russian economy to kind of heal and reassert itself in a very short time. Then came the interim years, the Medvedev parentheses, and so on, between the years of 2008 and 2012, and there were the Bolotnaya riots, protests, and there was public indignation, rightfully so, of course, with the cynical kind of arrangement between Medvedev and Putin concerning the re-handing back of the presidency to Putin in connection with the elections in 2012. And of course malfeasance and electoral fraud in the preceding Duma elections and also the presidential elections. So again, to cut the long story short, there was an obvious need for a new kind of political myth being introduced. It was not new, but it was very much kind of reinforced and very heavily stressed. And what I'm aspiring to now is the myth about the malevolent West, the demoralized, degenerated West that kind of at all times tries to infect Russia, destroy Russia, and where Russia is bound to play the role of the stronghold against such moral corruption. It was very much applauded by the Russian Orthodox Church and kind of cemented an alliance between the church and the Putin regime at the time. And this is this third myth is the one that has been now reinforced and transformed into a crescendo in connection with the ongoing full-scale war against Ukraine, because whereas it in the first days after its launch in, let's say, 2012, 2013, 2014, was a little bit jeered at and sneered at by analysts in the West as a kind of anomaly, as an anachronism. Now there are many who have realized the full potential of it to kind of introduce a Manichaean worldview that is uncompromising, and that really leaves no room for compromise in the conflict between Russia and the West.
Right. When you spoke about Putin and then Medvedev, do you think that Putin was or is aware of those myths, that he is developing them, or how he is associated with those myths? Was there any breakpoint that he said, like, this is what I will apply to my political career?
Well, I'm pretty sure that he has all along been surrounded by a team of a very well kind of educated and gifted spin doctors who've been able to kind of tailor make these myths to Putin, because they have not been constructed out of thin air. They are sentiments and popular ideas that have been there for a long time, for centuries even. And I'm sure that Putin has had certain some basic instincts about this himself, but that his spin doctors have been able to kind of craft this even more and reinforce it. So in these, if I may use the related term narrative, in these narratives, it is quite clear that Putin has been constructed as the embodiment of the heroes of these myths, and that has been in such a way so as to make things very difficult for any successor that is bound to appear sooner or later.
So when you were researching Putin and then when Medvedev took over, can you see any differences in development of that concept, or basically Medvedev was continuing in what Putin set up before?
Well, there was a time when he seemed to be a man of a somewhat independent action, with concerning his discourse on the need to modernize and to kind of develop the industrial and technological potential of Russia. That was in a kind of twist to the great power myth, but with a slightly different understanding than the heavily geopolitical connotations that the Putin regime has given to that that narrative. But then we are all well aware of the transformation, very negative, such that that Medvedev has undergone in recent years, when he is kind of expressing himself in even more radical ways than his master. Maybe to enhance his own credibility as a successor, I don't know, but one cannot help but feel a sentimental longing back to the days of his the early years of his presidency.
And how this myth, I mean, what Putin was setting up through his years of being in political power, is influencing people around him. Because you are the president, but there are ministries, there are institutions. Can you cover all of them with one myth?
Just to state one basic fact, there is a concept which I am pretty fond of, is the one coined by the sociologist, the British sociologist Duncan Bell, some years back, concerning a mythscape. And that is to say that there is not one single ruling political myth out there, but there are several ones that kind of that contest each other at times, but can also reinforce each other, and that is what I tried to show earlier, that Putin and his spin doctors have been very successful at kind of masterminding these the three maybe most prevalent ones, and make them play harmonize with each other. But that is the disadvantage of political myth, and I think I earlier referred to Roland Barthes, who also has made the observation that myth can also be a cunning companion, in the sense that it can, pretty much like the ring in Lord of the Rings, that it can desert its own old master if there is a feeling that this person, that the leader, does not really fulfill his role according to the myth, and others might be in a better position to do so. Then it can be a really false companion, and kind of turn against its former master. But then there was also something in your question that kind of made me think of the misunderstanding of myth, that this is just myth, this is just false. We have to remember, of course, that Russia is an authoritarian political system with a whenever more restraining, more increasingly restricted room for dissensus and for deviating and differentiate different views on things. So even though there might be people in the political elites who do not, in their own thinking, kind of associate themselves with a certain mode of action prescribed according to political myth, say the ever-present conflict between Russia and the West. Then it's not really conducive to that person's political career to say so and to voice that opinion publicly. So either it's about paying lip service, or it is about not saying anything at all.
Right. Just quick follow-up, because naturally there is the second question. Can we identify any tools or instruments that help to that leader to keep a control over that political myth? How do we keep control over the myth? Or is it even possible to do it?
No, probably not. What I have argued in my book is that the ability to communicate a good story in the political myth tradition also is associated with the Weberian concept of charismatic legitimacy. That the political leader needs to have some kind of communicative deftness to be able to be credible. And unless that leader is credible in that sense, he or she would also lose the mastery over political myth. So I would say that this was very obvious to the observer in the years 2020, 2021, when Putin all of a sudden did not really seem like the able doer that he has always tried to depict himself as. He was confronted by the very charismatic figure of Alexei Navalny, with all his energy at that time and vigor. And he was also confronted structurally by the ugly phenomenon of COVID-19, which kind of cut Putin very much down to size, and did not at all show him as a courageous and bold political actor, rather as someone who was kind of disinclined to do anything at all.
When it comes to the political myth, can we say that it must have a certain stability during the political career of the leader so he can implement that myth? And if so, can we identify any ups and downs when Putin was working with that concept of political myth?
I would say that there are, and that is a distinction that I'm working on right now in my writings, that there are political myths at different levels.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So there are other meta narratives, which I mentioned already, the three big ones: the great power thing,
the major
great
ones.
powerhood, the cyclical reappearing times of troubles, and the ever-present contestation with the West. Then there are kind of supplementary myths that can be applied more kind of piecemeal, in a sense, that could serve to prop up the myths, but it could also maybe serve a bit to erode the leading political actors in their kind of acting out on the myths. And I would say that the action-oriented leader is one of those such supplementary myths, which Putin personified for quite a substantial number of years. We remember those ridiculous photos with him riding bare chest on horses and so on, fishing in a stream or whatever. Which were by and by replaced by the elderly statesman who rather tried to signal stability or even, well, that's even stagnation, perhaps, in a way, in a fashion comparable to his Central Asian counterparts. I would tend to suggest that this was a consistent strategy to go from the action man to the sage to the wise political leader, but it was not altogether efficient, so a different narrative was needed. And not saying that this was a primary objective behind the decision to launch the all-out war on Ukraine. But there is some kind of substance to it, that this depiction of the wise and aging leader was not really as popularly appealing as it was hoped for to be.
Let's move on and let's speak a little bit about the concept of the political myth in terms of the society, meaning to unite or to polarize the society in Russia. What can we see in this way happening, or it happened, and in which way we can assess that political myth? Can we even predict what will happen in the near future based on what we already have, or not?
Yeah, we know that the idea of Russia being a predetermined great power is very popular among people in the Russian population, and that was really one of the major reasons why Putin was elected in the first place in the early 2000s. That he managed to restore the credibility of Russian great powerhood. Well, first of all, putting Chechnya to heel, and also depicting Chechnya as the kind of universal evil at that time, behind all negative manifestations that then were prevalent in Russian society. And that shows also the uniting and disuniting potential of the concept of political myth, because it is the matter of finding that story that I mentioned that makes a difference to people, that is important to people in general. But it is like it has been told about national identity as such. It's a great thing for those who are on the inside, but there has to also be someone on the outside who is who is the other, who is the force that needs to be kind of combated and struggled with, and thus deemed not to be worthy and to be shunned. So that is the disuniting potential. And it's like someone said that it's like a refrigerator, but a refrigerator in reverse. It is warm and cozy on the inside, but forbiddingly cold on the outside.
Right. I think to some extent it sounds logical to use the concept to unite the society, but are there any instances when a leader wants to use the concept to polarize the society?
Well, think of Donald Trump. He used the concept to polarize society, to make America great again, but to do so on Trumpian terms. That was pretty much about polarizing, reaching power through the polarization.
Right. And when we touch a bit the war in Ukraine and the concept of political myth uniting the society, how is Putin doing in this way at the moment?
According to the monthly polls by the Levada Center, the president is doing pretty well in maintaining the beliefs and his ability to deliver on the Russian great powerhood. Because according to those measures, he's still beyond above 80% of kind of approval. And this is, of course, what you mentioned earlier as the way of achieving popularity internally through polarizing and through depicting an external other. And that has been all the time a defining characteristic in Putin's presidencies. He started out with Chechnya, as I mentioned. He moved on to kind of pinpointing the oligarchs as the main enemies. It was Estonia there for a while in connection with the Bronze Soldier incident. Then it was Georgia in 2008, and then it's been Ukraine and Ukraine as a proxy for the West and for the US. So that is his mode of kind of governing and being at the top.
Right. And when we just spoke about this uniting the society and creating some concepts, I'm thinking about people who are Russians, but they live abroad and they have certain statues. For instance, Khodokorsky, some actors, some singers who left Russia. Can they potentially be obstacle for Putin continuing to sustain the myth or to basically keep the narrative as it is? Or they can represent a power as a counter power against this myth?
I would say that it's closest at hand that they are depicted as traitors, and that as depicted as persons who kind of bear witness to the truths of the myths. That Russia is always at risk. Russia is always beleaguered by the West, and the West is at times helped by internal traitors to try to get at Russia and to bring it down. Of course, there might be a formidable persons in those circles that you mentioned that could kind of launch counter myths and make it credible in the mythscape that the official interpretation is no longer valid. Let's hope so. Let's hope for that will be the case. Because it's not that many years ago, after all, that the political myths propping up the Soviet Union turned out to be pretty hollow and were not followed by the popular majority. But probably there needs to be setbacks, politically, militarily, economically, in order for those counter myths to be credible.
Because I also notice when I'm watching some YouTube videos made by those people, there was the implementation of the concept of being a foreigner agent. So when they have the video, they put that sort of notice before the video starts that they are, foreign agents, or basically they are marked as foreign agents by Russia or Russian government. And I think this also contributes to some sort of protection of that myth. Because otherwise, without that notice, you would consider those people as Russian people. But suddenly you have that barrier. Oh, he or she belongs to that foreign agent category. Can we trust him or her or not? So because I'm watching many those videos about life, about culture, history, and not all of them are related to politics. But still they have that barrier being marked or labeled as a foreign agent. So that's just my observation of when we were speaking about how to keep or how to maintain that concept of myth. This little help is so significant because in those videos, the notice is for like 10 or 15 seconds over there is a black screen with the white writings. I was labeled as a foreign agent. So that's my experience, how you can help to protect that political myth.
I think you're quite right. And again, I would say that the spin doctors know what they are doing.
That's a good expression. Let's touch a little bit the Russian identity, which is a whole complex concept, and we can speak about it for 6 hours. But can we assess how much of the myth or the concept of myth is in the contemporary Russian identity?
Yeah, I would say that and I think I've touched upon this earlier, that the myth that is really a central component part to the national identity is the notion of Russia as a great power, as a predetermined great power, and that's it. It is kind of unthinkable to have it any other way. And of course, it's not Russia is not unique in this. I mean, you have the same ideas in the United States. You have the same idea in France, for instance, China, without doubt. So I'm not saying that Russia is a unique case here. But that is probably the most kind of outstanding characteristic in this regard, and connected to this, there is also the pretty popular idea that Russia needs to tread its own path. It is a distinct kind of civilization. It stands for an alternative, and so on. As contrasted with the pretty popular idea in the 90s that Russia needed to approach the West and join the West, be part of the West.
If there was one element or maybe sentence that we should really add to that contemporary Russian identity, what would it be? What would you add to that Russian identity so it can be more accurate?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Realism.
Okay, and why?
That there are certain limitations to an individual, to the power of an individual state.
So if we move in, when we mention contemporary as a word, there is a young generation, and those people, they use internet, they use social media, and all those instruments of the modern age. How is this modern age in relation to the concept of political myth?
I myself belong to the older generation, so that is not really my world. But I would say that, of course, the concept of new social media adds quite new dimensions to the myth making, with all memes and so on that are being added. And I remember, if only you go back 10 or 12 years in time, then there was a time when Putin was quite ridiculed in social media, very heavily, to an extent that I don't think he is today, because it would be kind of it would be subject to legal consequences. And but it adds a new dimension to the mythscape, definitely. It also adds a new dimension to the opportunities for the state to create to kind of spread its disinformation, and to discredit counter narratives in different ways. So there is a jungle out there. It could be used constructively. It could be used productively. It could also be used with disastrous consequences. And one thing that one could say in this context is, of course, that we mentioned Navalny earlier, and while he was still not kind of incarcerated, then he was, of course, a master in his generation of social media use, and dwarfed the regime in that sense, and show the power of this kind of contrastive landscape.
When I was researching the discourse of Medvedev in the past, I had to go to RIA Novosti, Kommerstat, all those newspapers to basically grab something if I wanted to use something else than the official documents on the official websites. But then I think the Russian elite, they understood that Twitter was not entirely for them because they could be blocked. So they jumped to Telegram. And if you go nowadays, Medvedev, for instance, is using Telegram because nobody can block him on Telegram, unless the Telegram as a company will block his channel. But that freedom of expression, in some way, I think it was accelerated by the social media because they could say something immediately without going to the RIA Novosti or Russia One TV channel, So you have more flexibility with social media to maintain, to keep, to accelerate the concept of political myth in that extent. That's my personal observation based on my research.
Mm-hmm. No, but I think you're quite right. Then even if he moved on to Telegram, my impression is that Medvedev is not altogether successful in that setting either. But that's another story, perhaps.
Yeah, but in some way, if we have to be critical, in some way, all the Western media are on it. So we have the connection of spreading those information anyway, which I think in some way helps him. Even those statements are very, controversial / radical, but he has that sort of freedom. So I think in some way, after listening to what you were saying, that social media might accelerate a little bit that flow of information, which might help to those leaders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, also social media can go backwards because, as I said, people who live abroad might also have channels criticizing Putin's regime or Medvedev.
Absolutely.
So let's go for the last question, and the last question would be: we want to speak about this concept as something that junior researchers, maybe some students, would like to use in their work, maybe publishing papers, books. What would be your recommendation? How to approach this concept so we have, on one hand, the accuracy of expression, some ethical considerations, and we don't fall into the trap that behind everything is Russia, behind everything is the West, So how would you address this to those people?
I think I've hinted at one route earlier, namely to avoid thinking of political myth as a theoretical tool that is only applicable to Russia. I mentioned early on that I had used the concept in researching Swedish politics, for instance, and I did also mention the use and usefulness of the concept when in studies of the United States, of France, of China, of the UK. And I think that is quite important because we don't want to end up in the trap of essentializing Russia, eternalizing Russia, and taking for granted that that Russia cannot be changed and Russia is unique and all this. And so, but rather it's the matter of social constructions and social phenomena that are comparable to similar phenomena in other states and should be assessed accordingly. Then there is, of course, also another danger that should be averted, namely to take the political myths at face value and to kind of advertise them as if they were these truths that that I originally from the outset claimed that they cannot be interpreted as. So all the time be critical and bear in mind that there is no uniqueness in this.
Can we touch a little bit and reveal a little bit your methodology? You are working with what sort of sources when you are researching the political myth?
Above all, official political speeches, official texts, that has been the main source.
And when you have those sources in English, Russian, maybe French, is there an impact when you're translating those texts, or not really? Or how important is to understand the language when you're researching the sources, based on your experience, of course?
Of course, it is important. And to be quite honest, I've been using both Russian and English versions of those speeches. I may not at all times have been consistent in comparing the two versions, but in cases when I have, then of course one notices that whereas the translations are mostly quite okay, then there are portions that are kind of left out and kind of not being translated at all. But definitely the one should make a more consistent analysis out of that, and I think someone has surely done so.
Can you say a few words about the center? Because at the beginning we had an introduction when I spoke about the center, the Russia, Ukraine, and the Caucasus Research Center. What you guys doing in Sweden? What trends are you researching? And maybe a few words for students, maybe possible your students, people who are interested in reading your work, maybe your colleagues. So what is that center about? Like, what would you say about it?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, we are, to start with, at Malmö University is the second youngest research university in Sweden. So it was given those credentials as research university only 5 years ago. It was founded as a university 25 years ago. But the RUCAR Center, the Russia, Ukraine, and the Caucasus Regional Research Center, is a pretty small congregation. But we bring together some fine scholars within the political science tradition, doing research on Russia and Russia, Ukraine, and neighboring states. And we bring it together our expertise with linguistic expertise, humanities expertise on the Caucasus. So we form a rather dynamic milieu, I would say, in that sense.
Thank you very much. That was Professor Bo Petersson from Malmö University. Thank you very much for giving us the insights about the concept of political myth, and thank you very much for your time, for your words, and for your encouragement for young junior researchers to use the concept in the future studies. Again, my pleasure to speak with you. Thank you again.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye and see you next time.
Well, goodbye.